in my mind, I was thinking the upshot of the multiple kinds versus natural kinds debate would have some practical implications for robot ethics, because if you have like an analog, it doesn't have to be like an isomorph of us, but something that has consciousness that is analogous to ours that was made in a lab, then it
Mm.
looks like it should probably have the same rights that come with ours. But if you go in for like a multiple kinds view, then maybe it shouldn't, because it's been programmed or it's been created with different goals, and so maybe it
Oh,
really
I
likes.
see.
Do you see what I'm saying? So it
Yeah,
wouldn't have the
yeah,
same rights as us, because it's just a different type of thing. Although it's conscious,
I see.
it's not
Yeah.
analogous. It's a whole different new thing. It didn't reach our level. It's a different whole thing.
Yeah, it reminds me really strongly of, do you know the pig that wants to be? Do you know
I don't
this?
think so. I don't think so.
It's a joke in one of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy books. Some chef uses science to breed a pig who that desperately wishes to be eaten.
Yeah, sounds exactly right. Yeah, this
Yeah.
is what. Yeah.
And then the question is it right to eat them? So if the organism or the synthetic machine had a kind of consciousness such that its desires were completely and utterly diverging from ours, would it have the same moral rights or would it have very different ones?
Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. I'm your host, Parker Case, and this is a podcast where we explore all the deepest ideas in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. Today's episode is very, very special. I have with me Dr. Henry Taylor, and we're going to be discussing consciousness as a natural kind. And if you guys are avid listeners of the show, you know that I've been kind of thinking about this idea for a while, kind of toying with it. And I was very excited when I saw Henry's essay being passed around on Twitter. And then he raises a bunch of arguments against that view. So I was like, dang it. So I had to have him on to disabuse me of this idea. He is associate professor of philosophy at the University of Birmingham. And his interests are, philosophy of psychology, neuroscience, metaphysics, philosophy of mind type stuff. I'm really excited. It's totally what this channel is all about. Before we jump in, though, I want to thank everyone who's making this podcast happen on Patreon or on YouTube members. If you guys like this show, if you guys like what I do, it's a lot of work. So please consider becoming a Patreon patron or a YouTube member. You can support the show. You can keep these lights on, pay for the fancy cameras, and feed not just one, but two of my dogs, because I just picked up another puppy yesterday. He's Theophilus's dog, and his name is Anaximander. So you'll be seeing him on the show from time to time. All right, that's probably enough. Support the podcast, like all that stuff, please. Thank you. Let's jump in with Dr. Henry Taylor, and let's talk about consciousness in general and consciousness as a natural kind, and why we shouldn't think of it that way. Henry, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, man.
But yeah, thanks for having me. Congratulations on the puppy.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. Um, yeah, it's good and bad news. So I didn't sleep last night because of him, but he's super cute and my wife loves him and I love him too. So
What breed is he?
he is a reverse. Oh man, check this out. Okay, so he's a reverse sheepadoodle. He is tuxedo merle. So that's extra money. I didn't know that until had to pay for him. But he's a reverse sheepadoodle, so he's three parts old English sheepdog, one part uh doodle or poodle. Yeah, standard poodle. So he's funny.
Wow. Awesome.
Yeah, he's a goofy dog. Um so, Henry, first of all, thanks so much for coming on the show. This is awesome. I'm really excited about it. Before we jump into consciousness type stuff, I always like to hear from my guests. How'd you get into philosophy? And then, if you can think of it, like what made you want to become a professional philosopher?
Um, I guess let's go into philosophy, I suppose, because I was quite, I think in school we did a little bit of philosophy of religion. And I think and it was the tiniest, most sort of rudimentary stuff.
Sure.
But I really remember coming across the ontological argument for the existence of God. And there was something about it that, because the standard reaction to the ontological argument is that people just think it cannot possibly work.
Right.
I think that's how most people generally think of it when they first come across it. But it always struck me as somehow there's something very strange about the fact that it kind of struck me as strange that people were so dismissive of it, whilst it also being so important in the history of philosophy. So I kind of had this feeling that there was something I wasn't quite getting
Wow.
about it. And that kind of made me really curious about it.
Hmm.
And then ultimately, when I when I had to pick a university degree, it had to be either philosophy or English. And I'm a really slow reader, so I just couldn't take English. So I went for philosophy instead because I knew the papers were much shorter.
Yeah.
That, that really is the only reason I ended up doing it.
Wow. Yeah. Um, okay, so my audience, there are a lot of philosophy of religion folks in my audience, and they're gonna wanna know, like, what would you ever decide on the ontological argument?
I haven't decided.
Okay.
I
That's
quite
good.
my old PhD supervisor, EJ Lowe, developed a version of it, which I think his belief was that it was the best version available.
Mhm.
Um, and I read that, and that it was. I think the issue with the ontological argument is, even if whenever I've seen a version of it that's been halfway convincing, it's always relied on a lot of other kind of assumptions that I just don't feel qualified to talk about.
Sure.
So the modal ontological, I know you've interviewed Alvin Plantinga, modal ontological argument, there's a lot of modal logic and a lot of modal metaphysics in there. And I think it would probably not the best idea to try and assess the argument before you know about that stuff. So I
Right.
think it wasn't so much interesting in terms of whether it was convincing or not. It was
Yeah.
more interesting because it taps into so many other bits and bobs, like it's
Totally.
stuff to do with conceptual analysis, properties, modality, conceivability,
Right.
all that kind of stuff. So I haven't decided.
That's awesome. Well, I always make that pitch for philosophy of religion because, like you've discovered with the ontological argument, a lot of arguments for God's existence pull in all these other subfields in philosophy, and it's not as easy as just being like, "Well, that doesn't work because of this." You have
Yeah.
all these commitments, and you have to get in deep, and I love it because it sucks you deeper into philosophy, and I love philosophy. Um,
Mm.
this paper that we're going to be talking about today, it's a paper where you pose some problems for thinking about consciousness as a natural kind. The paper is called, for the audience, Consciousness as a Natural Kind and the Methodological Puzzle of Consciousness. Before I keep preempting, but before we jump in, deep, some people, you've noted to me that some people find problems with studying consciousness scientifically, just in general. Can you lay that out for us? Why would someone think it's hard or impossible to study consciousness as a science or develop a science of consciousness?
Yeah. So there are two reasons. Well, I mean, there's many, many reasons, but there's two main ones. Partially they're historical. So partially it is just throughout the 20th century, we had the rise of a approach called behaviorism, and
Right.
like which I'm sure you're familiar with, in both psychology and philosophy, um, associated with people like Willard Quine and B.F. Skinner, and it attempted to understand the mind in terms of the behavioral dispositions of the subjects. So the idea was when we say, "Oh, you love cookies," all that really means is you're disposed to take a cookie if I offer you one,
Right.
or you're disposed to say yes when I say, "Would you like a cookie?" So it's this very sort of third personal, almost eerie picture where I say, "Would you like a cookie?" And you say yes, and that's what um, then that's what the mind is. So that's pretty much out of favor these days. But what's interesting about it is that it's often kind of made fun of in contemporary philosophy, behaviorism. But it developed a lot of quite sophisticated techniques for psychology,
Hmm.
and consciousness just fit very, very poorly with that because it's just not at all clear what kind of behavioral account could give of consciousness. So consciousness had a kind of, it was a sort of dirty word in psychology for a long while. That changed in the late 50s and early 60s with figures like Noam Chomsky, and Donald Broadbent was a philosopher, was a psychologist, sorry, who wrote a sort of underappreciated book called Perception and Communication, um, which was one of the contributing things that demolished behaviorism. But its kind of legacy of being very suspicious of consciousness, in both philosophy and psychology,
Hmm.
kind of still remained for a long while. Having said that, it's not purely historical. Consciousness is really hard to study. Um, one of there are basic problems, but the sort of main overarching problem is to do with its privacy.
Yeah.
If you're conscious, then arguably you're the only person who knows your conscious experiences. You're certainly the only person who knows your conscious experience in those particular ways. You're the only one who can have your conscious experiences. I'm the only one who can have mine. And you can't just put what some people sometimes call a consciousness meter to
Mm.
detect whether someone's conscious. You
Yeah.
know, if you have a question like, is a pig conscious? You can't just do a blood test. And for this reason, a lot of people have had this idea that there's something suspicious about trying to study it from a third person point of view.
Mhm.
And that gets allied to this other claim, which is in order to study something scientifically, it needs to be third personal and objective. And that's why it's generally thought to be really difficult. It's changing quite a lot. There are figures like Stanislaw Dehaene and Claire Sargon and various other really great consciousness scientists. So it is certainly changing, but in some areas of psychology, studying consciousness directly is still, even to this day, looked upon with quite a lot of suspicion, and sometimes with good reason, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm coming in from like the philosophy of mind, and I'm taking kind of a hard fork in the podcast and going into AI type stuff, and trying to read, the seminal works in there. W Shoot, if I could name them, I would sound really awesome, but I can't think of it right now. Um, so I'm reading these works, I'm trying to figure out what's going on, and I'm seeing, as I've been studying this for the last, year or so, uh, the science of consciousness, they use different language. They have different
Yeah,
theories than the
yeah,
philosophy of consciousness and the philosophy of mind type stuff. And I thought, I finally had a good handle on philosophy of mind, and here we are in this other realm, and everyone's talking about computation so much and patternism, and
yeah,
it's been really fun to get into it. But I've I'm more familiar with people who would say consciousness is irreducible, it's private. And then when I talk to people on the AI theory type side or computer science, they're like, well, let's just, bracket that off. And they don't say as much. That's maybe philosopher language, but they want to bracket that whole thing off and say, just, yeah, assume that it is, and no big deal. Let's just keep running with it. Why? It's almost as if they don't want to deal. Some of the ones that I've talked with are like those philosophical puzzles. Like, you guys can go play with those, but we're gonna go develop AI and stuff.
yeah,
Have
yeah.
you found that yourself, or is that just my own circle?
Um, I've definitely found it. I interact with a lot of people. I interact with quite a lot of people in computer science, obviously in psychology,
Hmm.
but I've spoken to some roboticists as well and some sort of computer sciencey
Yeah.
psychologists. The I'm not really sure what to think about it. On the one hand, I think that there's this kind of strange tension
Mm.
where everyone kind of agrees that AI throws up all sorts of problems and issues, which are both ethical and for like society and for the way we view robots and non-human thinking machines. So they're both ethical problems and also practical ones. What I've found is the roboticists I've spoken to have, for a start, there's a slight selection effect because I have spoken to more roboticists than sort of theoretical computer scientists. So they do tend to be very interested in how can I build a machine
That's right.
that can go into like an earthquake zone, which is a totally laudable thing to do.
Right.
But there's the ones I've spoken to do tend to be quite open minded
Mhm.
because of their nature. They're the kind of people who want to talk to a philosopher. Um, but so they're interested in the big picture questions, like all these kinds of questions about how much we want robots interacting with us in our day to day lives. But my impression is that those questions are already so difficult and so advanced
Hmm.
uh, that to go in and ask an even more difficult question, which was like, when is my robot conscious? Uh, does my vacuum cleaner have rights? you know, um, and under what conditions should we be giving robots rights? I think that, you know, the whole field, as far as I can tell, the whole interdisciplinary field of cognitive science is just getting its head around the most basic questions that I just I'm personally quite skeptical of whether we could even answer the consciousness question right now.
Mm,
But that fact is kind of directly in tension with the fact that it's clearly such an important one.
right.
Um,
I'm with you on that. Yeah.
it's just really hard to know what to do.
Yeah. And that's another getting into this new field, I'm finding new t new beef points, new places where people are fighting. And so you got the AI safety people and you got the robot rights people, and they're both
Yeah.
very, very fervent in their positions. And it's like, I understand. I see the arguments on both sides. I get it, guys. I don't know where I'm at. Like, pick a side. We're gonna go to war. Like, all right, just settle down. Um, so you said so you recounted why some people might think that it'd be difficult to have a science of consciousness. I think especially my philosophical friends, my philosopher friends, they're really those who have read Searle's Chinese Room or blocked Chinese Nation stuff. They're like, yeah, of course, yeah, you can't have this. Where are you at on this? Do you think that it's uh it's possible to have a science of consciousness?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I can't see a solution to all the problems
Hmm.
now, but I am generally quite confident. It's interesting you mentioned blocks. The Chinese nation argument was from 1978, I think.
Hmm.
So it's uh, getting on a bit these days.
Yeah.
I think I wouldn't want to speak for him, of course, but I suspect that Ned Block himself would be much more optimistic these days.
Hmm.
Those old arguments that you referred to, um, the Searle and Ned Block style arguments, are very much directed at kind of what cognitive science was doing a few decades ago. So, like old fashioned functionalist arguments,
Yeah.
which, the view that the mind is defined by its causal role in mental architecture.
Yeah.
I don't, one of the things for me is that I've never really come up with really good philosophical solutions to all the problems that are often raised by philosophers.
Hmm.
I've just seen a lot more. So I don't really have philosophical reasons for being more optimistic. I've
Hmm.
just seen a lot more psychology that's trying to study consciousness where I look at it and think, oh yeah, that's really impressive work,
Yeah. Yeah.
Or there's just been so many occasions when I've thought about these philosophical problems, and then I've met scientists where I've thought, oh yeah, that's quite like so a philosophical standard philosophical problem might be, how do you study the consciousness in a human being who's outwardly unresponsive?
Right, right, yeah. Yeah, we've
So
had some of those conversations. With Garrett Mint, he came on and we talked a little bit about that,
oh,
or how to test for consciousness in non-linguistic, presumably conscious beings, including
yeah.
locked-in syndrome and infants and maybe robots and stuff, yeah.
Yeah, one of my colleagues, Davinia Fernandez Espejo, works on all that kind of stuff, and I kind of um, I'm far more optimistic about those kinds of things than I used to be.
Mm,
Partially because of things like natural kinds framework.
yeah,
There are sort of really big problems for consciousness science, though. To be
okay.
honest,
Yeah.
so I don't want to sound too optimistic. Um, the methodological puzzle, just to give a very brief characterization of it, is um, the primary way you find out what someone's conscious states are is by their report, or typically their verbal report or their external behavior.
Mhm,
But of its nature, that means you can only ever detect conscious states which are reportable
yeah,
or which come out in behavior somehow. So if there were any sort of conscious states that weren't reportable or didn't show up in behavior at all, presumably study them.
yeah.
And in its essence, that's the problem. And I don't have an answer to that problem, but I just have this vague feeling that maybe we'll solve it.
Yeah. Well, I guess, I wonder what counts as behavior. It seems like in principle, what counts as behavior here for testing consciousness would be anything third person accessible. So even if you had like a cerebro organoid, if you gave it a little laser shock and it reacted, um, would that count as behavior?
uh, yeah, I don't know. What's a cerebral organoid?
It's like you had, like, a petri dish of, like, a brain cell, and you kept growing it, and at some
Oh,
point,
right.
it's starting to have folds and start to look like a brain, and it's like, "Yeah, is this thing conscious, or what do we do with this thing?" You know?
Oh, right. Wow. That's interesting. It reminds me a lot of the experiments that were done on sea slugs in the 50s,
Hmm,
where Aplysia sea slugs don't. I think I'm right in the empirical details. They don't have a localized brain. They don't have like a brain. They
okay.
just have sets of ganglia. So that's how kind of um, far down the evolutionary tree they are.
Wow.
But they also show avoidance behavior as well.
Okay.
Um, it would count as behavior for sure. Whether it would count as behavior that indicates consciousness is yet another aspect of the problem. It's like,
Right.
how do you study conscious states that don't lead to behavior? Hard to know.
Yeah,
And how do you know which bits of behavior are indicative of consciousness?
yeah,
Hard to know as well.
yeah,
That's, they're all kind of parts of the same problem.
yeah. Well, okay, so I wanna push down on this problem just a little bit more before we jump into the paper details. A lot of my audience, again, will be very much influenced by Thomas Nagel. We love
Mm.
him. Christians love him. Non-Christians love him. Everyone. Christians love him because there's this one quote from one of his books where he's like, "I don't want there to be a God," and they're like, "Yeah, see." But I mean, we love this guy, and like The View from Nowhere is like classic text, right? And
Yeah.
or his bat paper. What's it like to be a bat? Where it just hammers this point that consciousness, the first person perspective is subjective and irreducible and only observable if it's observable, only has private access to the individual who has the first person perspective. Do you think are you optimistic about that as well? Are you optimistic about like I don't know, like a type of mental sharing or like Neuralink where I can link up with your brain in the future and experience your experiences? Or do you think that it like Nagel's right that like, no, this is absolutely irreducible first person perspective? Yeah.
And the what is it like to be a bat paper? Like most philosophers of mind, I've read it many, many times. It's an absolute classic. There is an interesting little piece of history there, which is that I think there's a quite obscure paper by someone called something Farrell in the 50s.
Hmm.
Well, I can't remember his first name. He was a psychologist, but it's about the problem of consciousness, I think, and there is a quote in there saying, "Often I do wonder what it is like to be a bat."
Huh.
Um, so it's actually about a separate topic. I don't think Nagel took the idea from there. I think it's just
Sure.
showing,
That's
but it's
nice.
just really striking that the idea of a bat, as you know, trying to imagine what it's like to be a bat is this kind of staple of explaining just how difficult consciousness is to
Right.
understand. I Yeah. So when it comes to subjectivity, I I have this when it comes to kind of consciousness studies generally, I'm generally pretty much open to anything.
Okay.
Um, uh, but in this particular area, which is the subject's relationship to their conscious experiences, I do have a very conservative, conservative in the sense of old fashioned
Yeah.
kind of view. So my general view is that conscious experiences are always had by one person, and
Cool.
it's essential to them that they're had by that person. Like that very conscious experience could never be had by anyone other than that particular person. Because
That's awesome.
I
I
kind
love
of
that.
think that I kind of think the person. It's hard to kind of express in non-mysterious language, but I feel like the person kind of partially makes up what the conscious experience is.
Yeah.
You and I could probably share a conscious experience, maybe, but it
Okay.
wouldn't be the same experience as I have it.
Because if you had mine, if you could tune into my experience, it would still be Henry viewing Parker's experience, right?
Yeah, I just think it would be a new, different experience.
Yeah.
Tuning into your experience would just change it because
Mhm.
I think, so I argued for this in a paper called "The Relation Between Subjects and Their Conscious Experiences,"
Mm.
and basically, I think when you spell out what a conscious experience is, it is a particular phenomenal state had by a certain subject.
Mm.
And that's what it is to be that experience.
Wow.
So if the phenomenal state was had by two subjects or three, or by a different subject, it would just be a different experience.
Yeah.
You can't share conscious experiences without changing them. That's my view. So it leads you to this quite old-fashioned, almost Cartesian picture where you have one subject.
That's why I'm getting so excited because I love that view. Yeah. Yeah. Um, I love the view partially because of the arguments and partially because so many people are like, That's not true." So I'm like, "Well, let's see if I can defend that view. That's nice." Um, what
Well,
about
I mean,
so
they say, "Oh, that's not true," but I've never seen anyone plausibly explain how I can link my brain to someone else
Right.
experience.
Right. Um, I wonder about a okay, and this is speculative, right? But let's say that I could, like, fission, I said I could fission, like, right now. So I had this qualitative experience, phenomenally conscious of the last, 20 minutes of talking with you. I have that memory, I had that qualitative experience, all that stuff, but I fission off, and now there's 2 of me, and
Mm.
I don't know, maybe you might say, like, one is the original and one's not, and so then one has false memories or something, but if it's a case of, like, genuine fission, it seems like both me and me too has, equal claim on my conscious experiences from the last 20 minutes, and yet we're 2 different people now, it seems like, but with the same conscious experiences. Do you
Yeah.
s do you see what I'm trying to gesture at?
Yeah, no, exactly. Um, that's an interesting case. It's like a spin on the classic brain split, the
Mhm.
problems for personal identity, isn't it? Um, that is an interesting case. I don't really know what to say about that case. I guess in my heart of hearts, what I want to say is, assuming you break off into two people and assuming that no one of you really does have better claim to be, you. Like, for example, if one of them kept all your memories and the other one didn't, then one of
Yeah,
them would have the better claim, wouldn't
right,
they?
right.
But assuming that's not the case, I guess my gut instinct is to say that there's two new people there, and neither of them really remember
Hmm.
um, the conversation. They just, what Sydney Shoemaker would say, they just Q remember it, they quasi remember it.
Ah,
They
yeah,
think it's their memory, but
sure.
it literally happened to someone else.
Yeah.
It sounds
Yeah.
a bit strange, but in some of my moods, I'm quite attracted to this
Hmm.
sort of four-dimensionalist picture of identity where you're never strictly the same person as you were in the past. You're just very, very similar. And if you're already kind of attracted to that kind of view, then it's not so strange to say you're not literally the same person as you were before the fission. You're just
Yeah.
really similar to them. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, and it also, fission's pretty weird in itself, so to say that, there you'd be a new person, and that's kind of weird, and that might be a cost. Well, so is fission. Fissioning off into 2 people is kinda weird also, so the whole thing's weird. I guess so if you did go in for, like, a more classical Cartesian substance dualism or, well, any kind of substance dualism, I guess, where there's a genuine substance. You might just say like, "Hey, that's not possible because the the soul would be the thing that individuates the person, and the soul doesn't fission, just the body would fission, and there'd be a new soul or something." So, I guess there's a lot of different ways you could go about answering this one. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that there are. I just think my Descartes scholarship is really bad, but I think that Descartes thought the soul was simple,
Yeah.
ontologically simple. Is that
Yeah.
right?
I believe so,
It can't be fissioned.
yeah, I believe so, and I think more the at least the Christian scholars that I know, who are kinda holding down the fort in substance dualism anyways, would say, like, it's a hexaity, and so
Oh, okay, yeah.
yeah, so, like, you're not splitting up hexaides.
Yeah, I think that, I guess there's two things I want to say about that. The first is there are non-Cartesian versions of substance dualism where the soul
Right.
isn't an whole. In fact, there's non-Cartesian versions of substance dualism where generally prefer to talk about the self rather than the soul.
Yep.
But what's interesting about the Cartesian, I kind of have to think myself into a world where you think the soul is a hexaity,
Yeah.
um, which I'd find it very odd for other reasons we can go into. But
Sure.
if that's what you did think, then the problem would actually disappear, because presumably what you'd say is, well, if you fission, then you've got two beings. It doesn't matter which one has them. It doesn't matter they both have the memories.
Oh, right.
You is whichever one's the hexaity.
Wherever you follow the hexaity, and that's personal
Yeah.
identity. Yeah,
I mean, the
that's the
hexaity is like is a thing. It's you stripped of all of its properties, isn't
I
it?
know.
The primitive, like,
And you can't say anything about it because then that would be a property, right? So, like,
yeah.
that's
So it's like,
the
well,
least
which one's me? Well,
satisfying. Yeah.
wherever the hexaity went. Is
Yeah,
that,
that's
or have I misunderstood the view?
no, I think you're right. I am a substance dualist myself, and a lot of
Mm,
times people will use that as an argument in favor of substance dualism and say, "Look, we can help with personal identity. Just follow the quiddity or the hexaity or follow the soul." But it's like, look, if it has none of the psychological continuity, I know that's not everything, but if it has none of it, like in what sense is it the same person, tracking it
yeah.
through? It seems so odd. And they well, well, every other review is weird too. And you're like, well, yeah, philosophy of mind's odd. Everything's crazy. That's why I like it. So
Yeah,
there's
you've got to
less and
be
more plausible, right? But
suspicious when people start saying, "Hey, every other view is weird too." Well, yeah, it is, but you still got to defend.
no, for sure. For
I
sure.
don't know. I quite, I think a lot of, I'm quite attracted to the Aristotelian picture of
Okay.
substances where their properties are essential to them as well as
Sure.
just being hexaeities. I don't know
Yeah.
if you're familiar with that. There's an old debate about whether you could have been a poached egg or not. Uh,
Yeah. I always
um,
ask. Yeah, I always ask if God could put my soul in a desk. That's my version of that, and my
yeah,
audience loves it.
it's a fine debate, but if you think that none of your properties are essential to you, then presumably you think you could be a poached egg or a desk.
Right.
And that it's the basic intuition that that can't be right that fuels the kind of Aristotelian picture, I think.
Yeah. Oh, there's also in substance dualist type literature, uh, people are saying, look, substance dualism is kind of just the nomenclature that's been inherited. We don't have to go in. We could be substance particular or pluralism, and there could be a bunch of
Mm,
substances, or it could be that you go in for an Aristotelian Thomistic substance dualism, wherein the soul is like the form which, informs the
yeah,
body, and then what's a body? A body is a substance plus an exemplification relation and some properties, and that's just, your bodily soul in that sense. And so it doesn't look like there's actually two substances after all. So I am kind of partial to that view.
that's a holomorphic view, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's like a thin particular hylomorphic.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So sorry for the folks at home, but those who have ears, let them hear.
Yes,
Let's
we we went too high too quickly.
That's good. Let's get
I don't know. The basic picture is that the self is the, the body is kind of the matter, and when it's arranged in a certain configuration, you also get the self, and then in the same way that marble is just a load of matter, but
Mm.
when you arrange it in a certain configuration, you get a statue. I mean, I sort of see why it's an attractive picture, but I just don't really see. Uh, is it more than just a picture? I don't really know enough about it, but I've never really seen the details like properly worked out.
So I think it would go the opposite way. It would say that
Uh,
the thin particular is first, is primary or fundamental. Uh, the language is tough because I know all those things mean different things.
yeah,
The thin particular informs and gives shape to the body. And without that, so if your soul is the thin particular, the form of the body, if that leaves, then you have a corpse. You don't have the body, right? That's like classic Aristotelian view.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so it would be like the opposite of maybe like ontic structural realism, where like you get the structure in place and then the person emerges out or is constituted by. I know everything is you have to be so careful because I don't know if they would go in for like a strong emergence view or if it's just a constitution view or what. But yeah. Well, let's jump back onto your paper.
yeah.
This was fun. Thanks for letting me go there. That was really fun.
It's,
Yeah. Okay, so can we go back? I think we need to go back to the methodological problem and just kind of just re-clarify it for people. Um, can you lay it out for us? What is this problem?
yeah. So it's similar to what I was talking about before. I'm going to say some things now which are actually false, but I'll say them just so you can get the kind of basic picture. So the problem emerges from, imagine quite a crude cognitive science, which tried to study consciousness. And it said, the only way that you can study consciousness is that the only way you can study consciousness in someone else is if they tell you you're conscious. So I say, are you conscious of this red ball? You say, yep, I can see that red ball. It's red and here are all its properties. And that means you're conscious of it. So that is the best evidence you can have that someone is conscious of a particular item. The methodological puzzle has many different aspects to it, but and there's an intuitive aspect to it and a much more kind of complex one, which is the intuitive idea is just, what if there were conscious experiences that were in there in your brain or whatever, and they were unreportable. You just didn't know about them, or you couldn't report them.
Mm-hmm.
In that case, so imagine you had a conscious experience of a red ball that you couldn't report, or just you chose not to report.
Okay.
And I said, can you see the red ball? And you just didn't say anything. I would then, as the scientist, I would say, well, they're not conscious of the red ball then, and that would be wrong.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of intuitive gloss on it. If we can only get at consciousness through reportability, then conscious experiences that are unreportable would be off-lit. We can never study them. That's the sort of intuitive bit. The more sort of the bit that really worries people is a bit more to do with the kind of scientific details, which is that one of the things we know, particularly from the study of vision, is that rather than talking about report, we tend these days to talk about cognitive access.
Right.
So rather than talking about explicitly what people verbally report, we talk about bits of information processed in their visual systems, which they can access in the sense of, knowing about, thinking about, using in further reasoning, reporting them if they want, consolidating them into memory. Now, we know that a lot more information gets processed in the visual system than we could ever cognitively access at any one time.
Mm-hmm.
You can access bits of it, but basically the capacity of the cognitive access system that allows you to report stuff, think about it, reason about it, consolidate it into long-term memory, that capacity is tiny compared to the amount of information that's actually processed by the visual system, which is massive.
Mm-hmm.
So the more the more sophisticated way of putting the methodological puzzle is, well, there's tons of information processed by the visual system. We only ever cognitively access a teeny bit of it. How much of it is conscious? Is it just the stuff that's cognitively accessed?
Right.
The cognitive access stuff plus a little bit more? Or is the cognitive access, the stuff with cognitive access, plus tons of other stuff that's conscious
Right.
that we never know about? And you can sort of see how the kind of intuitive description of the puzzle and the more sort of detailed one are kind of linked.
Right.
They're both to do with what if there's experiences that we somehow can't get access to, or what if there's more experiences out there than we could ever access. It's the same sort of basic picture.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
It does. It does. Okay. So is cognitive access the same thing as like Ned Block's access consciousness?
Roughly, yes.
Okay. Cool.
A philosopher would normally say, "Oh, no, because of these 38 definitions." But that's what he's getting at, I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
It's also, it's roughly, everyone uses all these definitions in different ways.
I know that's what's so tough, and it's really hard to. Are they saying the same thing or not? Yeah.
It's very tough. And Ned Block himself doesn't use the phrase access consciousness anymore. He tends to say cognitive accessibility, or
Okay.
just sometimes just cognitive access, to distinguish the stuff that's the information that's accessible from that which we actually
Yeah.
really do access and know about. And very roughly, it's the same kind of faculty that psychologists mean when they talk about working memory,
Oh, okay.
or neuroscientists mean when they talk about the global workspace.
Yeah, that's
Very roughly, they're the same ballpark.
yeah, it was definitely the global workspace was in the top of my mind there.
Mm.
Was accessible to me, I guess. Are there folks that would say, "Look, man, it's crazy to say that you have experiences that are not, like, phenomenally" oh, shoot. Okay. Um,
Phenomenon.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I think I might have just preempted what I was gonna say. So, are there any people who say that just cognitive access, that just is an experience? And so if you don't have cognitive access to something in your perceptual field, then it's not, actually appropriate to call it an experience?
Yeah, I think so. I think, um, but I think once you chip away a lot of the more, well, very important nuances and sophisticated bits of it, that's basically what global workspace theory says, I think.
Right, right.
So global workspace theory says there's this system which is located um, basically in the front of your head in prefrontal and anterior cingulate cortices and various other bits as well. And that's the global broadcasting system. When that system accesses information, then it becomes conscious and only then.
Yeah.
That's a kind of headline sort of characterization of global workspace theory. Anyone who held that view, I think, would probably say if it's not accessed by the subject, it's not conscious at all.
Gotcha.
And
Yeah.
it does it it's an extremely attractive view for many, many reasons. But but I think it's kind of stronger maybe as a view than it can initially look.
Right.
So, it's the view says that you're not conscious of something unless you actually cognitively access it, unless it enters your global workspace or working memory systems and is directly available for you to think about, reason with, store in long-term memory and so on.
Mhm.
That leaves an awful lot of stuff which is totally accessible if you wanted to think about it, but just choose not to.
Right.
So, if you think about the feeling that you have of your feet in your shoes right now, or, stuff, uh, anything else in your visual field which you could access if you wanted to, but choose not to, they've got to basically say that that's not conscious either, which is
Yeah.
completely reasonable, but it's a much stronger view than maybe it initially looks. You see
Yeah.
why?
Yeah, and it's like, yeah, it's limiting down the definition of consciousness. Like this is narrowing the field. Is this,
Yeah.
so I have, been coming around to studying Daniel Dennett a little bit more as I'm getting into philosophy of
Oh,
mindset
yeah.
stuff. Is Dennett a proponent of global workspace? Do you know?
I think so. He in 1991 he referred to his theory as the multiple drafts model.
Right.
Nowadays he tends to say fame in the brain.
Mhm.
Um, but I don't know if he would literally say I am a global workspace theorist,
Okay.
but there's definitely papers where he's talked about it in extremely positive terms.
Yeah.
I think in terms of philosophical proponents, I'm sure he doesn't agree with the entire whole theory. I don't know. You'd have to ask
Yeah.
him, but that general picture, the general picture is the same, which is there's tons of information processed all over the place, but the stuff that becomes conscious is the stuff that wins against the other
Yeah.
um, information and becomes available to all sorts of different systems in the brain.
Yeah, the draft
So
that gets published or, like, the one that gets the most fame in the brain. Yeah.
yeah, exactly, fame in the brain. So
Yeah.
like the way I like to think of it is like there's tons of information all over the place in the brain, but it's all in these separate, small, little, almost module things which do one thing and they have their information and it's kind of isolated.
Yeah.
And then you've got another system which has a tiny capacity.
Mhm.
Sorry about that. Which
No
has a
worries.
tiny capacity. And what's really cool about that system is it gives the information in it can be used by loads of different systems in the brain.
Yeah.
So a tiny capacity, but loads of different systems interface with it. And the stuff that gets in there is conscious.
Okay.
Uh, that's pretty similar to fame in the brain, isn't it?
That's what I was thinking, yeah, but I wonder if so we'll talk about this a little bit more too as we finally get into your work, but, uh global for a potential problem for global workspace is maybe I'm just thinking of this off the top of my head, if like the prefrontal cortex or lobe and all that stuff doesn't seem like it's from what I've heard, it's not fully developed until, like, 25 in men, and that's because I care about myself, so I was a man, so I'm like, "That's when I'll be, yes, able to think more and renting vans and stuff in the United States." Uh, does, uh I mean, does that impact global workspace? Because if consciousness is just, something that kinda wins fame in the brain, to use Dennett's term, and your frontal cortex isn't fully developed yet until you're 25, let's stipulate, then are you not fully conscious until the frontal cortex is developed?
No, um, I don't think so. I think so. Here's an analogy.
Mhm.
Your, you know, your legs aren't fully developed until you're an adult. Let's say
Mm,
you can still walk.
this is good. Yeah.
It's just that you know, it's just that you. I'm not even going to say you walk in a very different way. It's like walking's easy, when you're a little kid. Your
Yeah.
your organs, your legs don't have to be fully developed in order for you to do that. It might just be that the prefrontal cortex. I mean, there's a load of things that it's possible. Like it could be the prefrontal cortex is responsible for consciousness, for example, but that it can achieve that well before it's fully developed.
Yeah.
It might be that younger subjects, um, they 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 are maybe consciousness is not one of the most advanced things it does,
Right.
or maybe in organisms that don't have a prefrontal cortex, um, maybe the same function is realized by another part of the brain. If you
Sure.
see what I mean,
Sure.
it might
Yeah.
just that in I don't know anything about bee neuroscience or snail neuroscience, but might be in bees and snails, they might be conscious because the thing we prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate and various other bits and bobs, they do consciousness in us, but they might do something else might do it in
Totally.
bees.
Right. Right. Well,
So I
so
guess,
in
yeah,
well, the difference would be in us, we do know that if we do know that the prefrontal cortex does it, then bees, if they have some other mechanism that's cool and it's multiply realizable or something,
mm,
great. But in us, we know it's not developed when we're 7, like it's gonna be when we're 25. And I guess they could just say, "Look, maybe consciousness doesn't come in degrees, and so it's like a light switch, and it just all or nothing, and so when you're 5 or whatever, it just lights up." Or maybe they could say it comes in degrees, and it sounds weird, but it's not that crazy to think that a 25-year-old will have a richer sense of consciousness than a 5-year-old or something like that. Maybe that's not as crazy as it intuitively sounded to me at first.
it depends what you mean. Like, um, it depends exactly what you mean by that. Like, there are certain senses in which it's definitely true that consciousness comes in degrees.
Yeah.
So, like, I have a friend who has a daughter who's very young. When she looks at her toys, I'm overwhelmingly sure that she's conscious of them.
Yeah.
So I feel like she's conscious of those toys. Um, Now, there's a sense in which my consciousness is more advanced because I can think about, the oppression of the proletariat under late capitalism. Like, but
Yeah.
I take it. So I don't know. I mean, this idea that consciousness comes in degrees. Sometimes I've never been quite sure just how strong that's meant to be. Like when it says it comes in degrees, the idea that yeah, I can read Victorian novels about naval captains going to embassy
Mhm.
balls
Right.
and have thoughts she can't have, but the idea that it can be a matter of degree whether she's conscious at all, I do struggle a bit more with.
Yeah.
Uh, it might just be that, sure, there's things I can have conscious experiences of that they can't, but that's not to say that she's less conscious than me. We're both 100% conscious. It's just we have different conscious experiences.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, I think that's right. Well, yeah. So, yeah, there's a couple ways you could look at it. I guess there's like the, I'm thinking of like Rosenthal's like hot like hot theory, or that's
Mm.
redundant. His HOTS, higher order. Oh yeah, higher order thought theory. Um, that like okay, so degrees of consciousness could be maybe you're thinking like someone has more concepts which
Mm.
give richer experience, or you could say that the consciousness is or the experience is mediated through them. I don't want to say that because I'm more of a direct realist, I think, but what you could go that route, or you could go like the fading qualia type view and be like, no, they have, like, half qualia or something, and I think if your theory if a theory predicted that type of thing, where, like, a five-year-old has, like, more faded qualia, then that would be a pretty major cost for a theory, right?
It would be. It does. I am quite. I guess there is an argument against. Well, no, actually, what I was about to say was false. Peter Carruthers has put forward an argument which is vaguely similar, which where he argues that if global workspace theory, I'm going to butcher this, but if global workspace theory is true, then it must be vague whether animals are conscious
Mm,
because they instantiate some but not all of the features of the global workspace. I think
huh,
that's very roughly the argument. There's a good exchange with him and Jonathan Birch about this stuff,
okay.
actually. But I will be honest, I've actually written quite a lot on vagueness.
Hmm,
So I'm really interested in vagueness. And I would like to be the kind of person who understood what it meant for consciousness to be vague, but I really feel like I can't. Like the idea that the 5-year-old has conscious experiences, but I see bright red and they see like a light pink or something like. I just can't. I just like when you say they're vague or more faded. I just can't. I can't wrap my head really around it. But that
yeah,
I genuinely do believe that might just be a failure of imagination for me. I just
yeah.
find it so hard to imagine. I
No,
can
I'm
imagine
I'm
it
I'm with you on
in
that,
my
yeah,
experience, but I just can't
yeah.
imagine what it might be to be vague whether an organism's conscious or not.
That's and so I'm with you on that, and I think, maybe yeah, I'm with you on that, so I was thinking of that as like a cost. So if a theory does predict that, it's like, what would that even mean? Because I can't even imagine having vague, qualia
Mm,
or faded or anything like that, or absent. I guess absent, but like half absent or something. So if your theory predicts that that would happen, it's like, well, you have to explicate that for me because
right.
I don't even know what you're saying then. And so I don't think anyone would want to say that their theory predicts that, but if you can hold their feet to the fire, but I don't know, it's just that's just a random Parker's Pensée for everyone back home. Um,
I think it's a really good point. I mean, I'm a big fan of global workspace theory, but
Mm.
a huge I nearly said problem there. A huge question for it, which I've never really seen an answer to, is so the basic idea is you've got this. You and I uncontroversially have this system in our brains, which is the global workspace system, or in our minds, whatever. Um, and that we use that to make information available to a wide variety of systems like reasoning, verbal report, deliberative control of action, and stuff like that.
yeah.
A big question is, well, how sophisticated does that thing have to be?
Mhm.
Or before you get consciousness. So, like, if you had all those systems, but they were all way simpler, like maybe
Yeah.
they are in some non-human animals,
Mhm.
would it be conscious or not? I find that really, really difficult to say,
Yeah.
especially since a lot of the motivation for the view is on, is can't tell you one way or the other because it's done on subjects that just have a sort of the big
Yeah.
word.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
I mean,
and
that's like the problem you were getting at, wasn't it?
well, yeah, and so that's good because it's like this is supposed to be a science of consciousness, and I'm not throwing shade at anybody. I think it's fascinating too, but it's supposed to be a science of consciousness. But then when we say like, well, what about bees, and which are kind of
Mm,
like borderline case, maybe some people just go, no, they're automaton. But whatever, pick the animal that you think is borderline case. It
mm,
seems like then we're moving from a science of consciousness to a philosophy of consciousness because you're gonna have to throw in like a functionalism or something where you're like, well, look, it's just instantiating the same. inputs, outputs, and internal states. So you're like, well, wait, that's not the science of consciousness. So that's just like classic Putnam stuff.
Yeah.
Is that kind of the concern or the
Yeah.
question?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay,
If I'm going to deflect that question because I don't know the answer to it
good.
with an anecdote. So I'm going to rely on the worst way of answering a question.
That's great.
Before COVID, I was studying for to become a beekeeper, not full time, but
Okay.
I was learning about bees for that reason. And then COVID happened and it never got finished. So my view is that they are conscious, but that's purely for emotional reasons. Absolutely no reason whatsoever to believe that. Because I don't even know how you would begin to start
Mm,
trying to. I mean, that's not saying I'm skeptical about that kind of stuff. I think that there's some really good work done by people like Jonathan Birch and Heather Browning and various others in the LSE research group. Alexandria Boyle's involved as well, where I think the methodology for that group is to look at all the classic studies of consciousness, um, the classic markers of consciousness, if you will,
yeah.
look across biological taxa and kind of do a checklist where you're like, these organisms can do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, but they can't do 8, 9, 10.
Yeah.
And do that for various biological groups and then try and ascertain from that whether they're conscious or not. Um,
Yeah, that's tough because the philosophers are gonna be like, "Well, that still doesn't solve the problem of other minds." That's like or and then the other folks, there's some folks that I know are gonna be commenting now talking about wasps because I guess there's some new stuff on, like, wasps can recognize faces or something,
oh, is
and
that
they
right?
that's what I hear. I don't know, I'm just passing on maybe false news or fake news here, but I've heard that, so I'm not sure. I like the armchair stuff. That's why,
Mm,
we talked about Timothy Williamson coming on, and that's why part of it, I just wanna sit in the armchair and do my so I do need to get into the more of the actual literature, the scientific literature on the science of consciousness type stuff or markers or neural correlates and stuff like that.
mm.
Um, yeah, Henry, I
It's,
wanna
it's
yeah.
a hot topic at the moment in the UK. The LSE group, which is run by Jonathan Birch, I think, has recently been able to change the law about the rights of cephalopods, I think.
Hmm.
And uh, my marine biology knowledge is terrible, but there's a particular group which are now recognized as conscious organisms as a result of their work,
Oh,
um,
yeah, okay.
and given certain rights under the law as a result of them.
Does that
But
include, like, not boiling lobsters?
I honestly don't know, I'm afraid.
I've heard some things about that.
Are
Yeah.
lobsters crustaceans? I don't
Yeah,
know.
but I don't yeah, they are crustaceans, but I don't know when I hear cephalopod, I think of, like, roly-polies, and I don't know.
I don't know.
Yeah, I gotta yeah, this is the
I'm just
thing.
going to throw a
I'm
disclaimer in that everything I just said
yeah,
might be
yeah,
false.
yeah. Yeah, great, that's great.
Marine biology is all.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so we got we got cognitive access and consciousness. The methodological problem is distinguishing consciousness from cognitive access. And then you raise this novel problem. Again, folks, the paper is Consciousness as a Natural Kind and the Methodological Puzzle of Consciousness. The novel problem that you consider is conceiving of consciousness as a natural kind. If you do that, then you cannot distinguish consciousness from cognitive access. Um, does that sound right?
Uh, very, very close. It's one of the main advantages of the natural kinds approach, as it's called, to consciousness.
Mhm.
One of the things that at least some of its proponents have claimed is that it can help distinguish consciousness from cognitive access. So it's not like if consciousness is a natural kind, then the problem is unsolvable. It's more like if there's a solution, it won't stem from the fact that consciousness is a natural kind.
Ah,
This being a natural kind doesn't help you.
yeah,
Um,
because that's the
it-
claim of the natural kind theorists.
Sorry?
It's like that's the claim of the natural kind theorists that it will help, and you're saying no, it won't. Is that right?
Yeah, it's the claim of at least some of them. There's been work on consciousness as a natural kind is just gearing up now.
Okay.
The main thinkers would be people like Nicholas Shea, Tim Bain, Cecily Whiteley, and Elizabeth Irvine, although Irvine's a bit more skeptical um,
Okay.
of the approach. But certainly one of the main claimed advantages is that it can help solve the methodological puzzle. Yeah, and I
Yeah.
don't think it can.
Okay. Awesome. Um, okay. Well, you have this NAS principle that I might call it no access scenario. So it's this,
Mm.
scenario. Um, and folks, this is tough to do when it's like you need to go read the paper. I'll
Yeah.
make sure I'll link that so you can go and find it because there's only so much you can do on a philosophy podcast when you're not seeing it. But subject S has phenomenally conscious experience at time t, but S did not cognitively access that experience at time t. Oh,
Yeah.
sorry. Yeah, yeah, that's right. That's right. I almost just
Yeah.
butchered it. Yeah,
That's no, it's fine. It's just a more precise way of talking about the problem we were talking about before.
yeah,
So, like, problem is if we can only study consciousness through cognitive access,
yeah.
then what if there is a case where someone has a conscious experience that they don't cognitively access?
Right.
So that what I in the paper I called the no access scenario, it it has this sort of slightly annoying philosophers talk of like subject S at time t under condition P with properties X and things like
Yeah,
that. But really, that's what it's talking about. It's just saying if
yeah.
there were a conscious experience that the subject didn't access, then we couldn't know about it. That's all
Right.
it's
Right. Yeah. I always add those into my papers for my
saying.
professors, just the annoying philosophy, stuff, just because 'cause I'm like, "Look, I can do this too. Let me show you that I know how to use variables and stuff as well." And I think it probably annoys them because I do it too much. But, so you raise this puzzle, and another, clarification that you make is like, "Hey, I'm not saying" you say you're not saying that these situations do exist, but it looks like the possibility that they exist is what's doing the work, right?
Yeah, the problem is you can the methodological puzzle, it brief is you can only ever study conscious experiences that have been cognitively accessed.
Yeah.
So if there's any that aren't cognitively accessed, you cannot study those scientifically.
Right.
I don't know if I agree with that claim, but that's the methodological problem. That
Yeah.
is the problem. And so the problem is not that there definitely are experiences like that. The problem is we'll never know whether there are experiences like
Right. It's like if you had a net to catch fish and it had certain slats or whatever, certain holes in it, so it can catch all these fish. And you go, look, all the fish in this lake are this size. You go, how do we know that? If they were any smaller, they'd fall right through the net. You
that.
can't know that.
Exactly. That's exactly the problem. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Cool.
So our evidence only ever tells us it, our evidence is completely and utterly insensitive to whether there's tiny fish.
Mhm.
And
Right.
our evidence is totally insensitive as to whether there are conscious experiences that are uncognitively accessed.
Yeah. I
That's
wonder.
puzzle anyway. That's
I
the
wonder
idea.
if yeah, if a more pragmatist type thinker in the audience would say, does it matter? Because we would never be able to know, right? We'd never be able to know because our net is the same size, no matter what. So we never yeah, we there might be these tiny fish, but if we can't eat the fish, if it's not practical, like, if you have conscious states that you can't access, then how would we ever even know? And you're saying, "Well, look, if it's a possibility, because 'cause we're talking philosophy here, then certain ramifications or implications are had for different theories," right?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it definitely has. There's a couple of ways in which I disagree with that kind of pragmatist.
Yeah.
Thing. The first one is it flatly does have ramifications for scientific study theories of consciousness as well.
Okay.
So it's not that it's purely philosophical as a problem. Like it's more that there are certain theories which predict one thing and other theories which predict another.
Yeah.
So it's flatly inconsistent with some scientific theories and consistent with others. So it's not purely scientific thing. But I take it that the pragmatist is just going to say, I suppose the opponent that you're imagining might just respond to that and say, okay, different scientific theories do depend on it, but they don't matter either. Is that what they can respond
I don't
to?
know if they do that, then I don't know why they're watching this podcast. Yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah. That's too
Yeah.
far.
If we were a podcast about the science and philosophy of consciousness, and then you
Yeah,
say, well, who cares about science of consciousness? But
right.
I don't know, I find it hard to believe that there's no ethical ramifications.
Yeah,
Typically, people, I take it that a huge number of ethicists think that consciousness is ethically important in some way.
totally.
So
Yeah,
working out where it is in the brain, how it's brought about. I mean, if it is a brain thing, of course,
sure.
working out how it's realized, things like that. I take it that I find it find it very hard to believe that there's no more practical applications of that result.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so maybe continuing on that point, we can look at two scientific theories of consciousness. We've talked about global workspace, but bringing it back out and applying the no access scenario to global workspace, tying that up in a bow, and then the recurrent processing theory. So I think this might be a way to also, sorry, pragmatist, but we're gonna show you some direct implications here.
Well, I like pragmatism. I don't want to come across like
Oh, I love poking at my pragma I have some pragmatist friends who are like, "You," because I always characterize philosophy as, like, classical and then analytic and continental, and the pragmatists are always like, "What about us?" And the phenomenologists are saying, I'm like, "Sorry, guys, I can't include everyone in every sentence that I'm utter about philosophy," but yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I just taking a step aside. I quite like pragmatism and
Hmm.
phenomenology as well. I
Yeah.
don't. Why do we all disagree so much? You know, why can't that could be understood?
It's a good. Well, I try to bring them all on the podcast. I wanna hear from everybody. I really like the phenomenologist because I have a good, friend who's also now my professor who's a hardcore phenomenologist. So,
Oh, okay.
yeah, I like some of that stuff too, and it goes nicely with the philosophy of mind, so that's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um. Yeah. So yeah, theories of consciousness. So like, so now I'm a bit distracted. I actually have to go
Sorry.
and lecture. I have to lecture phenomenology in an hour. So my mind jumped ahead to that, but
Sorry.
we can't go there.
Yeah. Workspace and recurrent, process
Yeah,
theory.
we can't sit here drinking apricot cocktails talking about
Oh, man,
holidays.
that sounds nice. Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, okay. So global workspace theory very roughly says you've got this cognitive access system, and that's a multifunctional system, and its job is to take information from elsewhere in the brain or in the mind and to make it available to a variety of different reasoning systems.
Yeah.
So that's global workspace theory in a very crude form,
Mhm.
just sort of a crude summary. The problem, so what it says is, in order to be conscious, um, information has to be accessed by the global workspace. Therefore, it says that information which is not cognitively accessed is not conscious.
Yeah.
So the methodological puzzle says, well, if there's information that's not cognitively accessed, we could never know about it. But it also follows that if there's information that's not cognitively accessed, then global workspace theory would be false,
Mm.
because global workspace theory says only, and this is slightly crude because I'm sure there are some global workspace theorists who might want to try and sort of alter the view to accommodate this. But the classic picture of it is if the information is not cognitively accessed, then it is not conscious.
Right.
So that's the issue. If the kind of things, the no access scenario that I mentioned, if they're real, then global workspace theory is false.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, conversely, theories like the recurrent processing theory. So I have to be honest, my knowledge of this is much less detailed than my knowledge of global workspace.
Mhm.
But the basic idea is that there are many important processes in the visual system. Two that are particularly important is what's called the fast feed forward sweep. So the idea is that visual information enters your eyes, gets processed, gets routed from your eyes to the visual cortex at the back of your head via a system in the middle called the LGN.
Okay.
um, the lateral geniculate nuclei. It goes to the visual cortex in the back of your head, and the information sort of moves forward, eventually ending up in the front of your brain.
Mhm.
So ending up, that's the kind of process it has.
Yeah.
That's obviously a really crude picture, but there's a very interesting moment of processing called recurrent processing, which is where um, subsystems that are further along in this train start recurring information back to earlier
Yeah.
systems.
Yeah.
And that's and there are certain parts of that in visual cortex where consciousness arises according to recurrent processing
Okay.
theory. So
Yeah.
that view of consciousness is highly associated with the Amsterdam group of psychologists and neuroscientists.
Okay.
And like I said, I'm not as au fait with the details of that as I am with global workspace theory. But one of the important ramifications of it is that apparently it looks like you get recurrent processing in the relevant areas of visual cortex without cognitive access.
Hmm.
So that, if the theory is correct and recurrent processing in those particular bits of visual cortex are sufficient for consciousness, then given that they're not cognitively accessed, then there must be some conscious experiences that aren't cognitively accessed.
Um,
So all of that with lots and lots of detail. I don't know how many people are still listening, probably no one. No, but the take home message is recurrent processing theory says consciousness without cognitive access is possible. Global workspace theory says it's not possible. The only way you can decide between them is by working out whether it's possible or not.
Mhm.
Methodological puzzle says you can't. Therefore, the methodological puzzle is a problem for the science of consciousness.
Nice.
How was that?
Yeah.
Was that
I
right?
I love that. I love that. And, it's fun because, so I'm trying to introduce this to a lot of my philosophy of religion friends. But also I'm picking up a lot more, AI folks that are listening now. And I know global workspace is a method that's proposed in AI and how we're gonna have artificial general intelligence, and I believe recurrent processing theory was, like, eschewed by the, attention is all you need paper where they're like the large language models are all one way and they don't have recurrence, and some people say that's why they can never be artificially general intelligent or conscious, sorry, synthetic conscious. So just for all the folks at home, like this stuff is awesome because it's philosophy and I love that, but it also has all these implications in different fields
Oh,
as
yeah.
well, which are all like all the rage right now. So philosophy matters. Just all that to
Uh,
say.
oh, it does. Yeah. I mean, like I said earlier, there's all the science, sorry, the vast majority of scientists I've spoken to been really open minded about the contribution of philosophy to science.
Mm.
I'm just slightly concerned that there's a selection bias because the only ones willing to talk to me are the ones who are I mean that most of them don't like it at all. So,
Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
well,
well, that's a sub goal of the podcast is getting this stuff out there to the right people to hear it, um, which is fantastic. Well, okay, so
it's fine. Can I just
yeah.
jump in?
Yeah, please.
What's the attention is all you need stuff? I don't know. That
That's
sounds
like
like something I should know about.
that's like a big paper in large language model type literature because it's a bunch of Google scholars, folks from Google,
Oh, okay.
uh, and it's like a pretty important paper where I believe that was like one of the first ones that pitched the transformer model, which we're finding now in like, OpenAI type stuff, and they're
Mm.
saying like, we don't need this recurrence. All that matters is these, large transformers, and I have such a loose grasp on it. I'm trying to learn more because I got a bunch of AI guys coming on, but from what I've gathered, the, large language model type models are one way, and they don't incorporate recurrence, and so some folks think that is a problem if you wanna develop consciousness because looks
Right.
like we have recurrence, right? And so other people will say, "Well, no," and this is why the natural kinds thing's kinda fun because if consciousness is a natural kind, then this is how I'm thinking about it, and you can totally correct me. If consciousness is a natural kind, then maybe the way we get to it can be in various different paths, some with recurrence, some with not, but you're still getting to the same natural kind. So if you have a tiger that came from natural selection for billions of years, or you know 3D printed it, you're still going to get the tiger. You're still getting the natural kind, even though they have a different origin. That's the way I'm thinking about it.
That is interesting. I feel like I was trying to think about how to put this. I guess I feel like I should know about that better than I do, perhaps. My PhD was on attention, so I feel like I should have heard of that. But
Well, that's the
um,
thing. These are all different worlds, and they're like
they are,
subfields
yeah.
and it's like amazing. I'm trying to bring them all together, and it's so much work to be thinking, and they speak completely different language. It's wild. Yeah,
Well, I've spoken to computer scientists about like neural networks and
yeah,
large language models. But I think ultimately, like in terms of meta philosophy, you just need to have a lot of humility because
yeah.
I don't mean you specifically.
No, I do too, though. For
I,
yeah,
I you just can't like. There's no way that I could ever possibly learn enough to adjudicate whether
yeah, yeah.
that uh, whether you need recurrent processing in large language modeling. It's but yeah, it's always very interesting. But the more you talk to people, the more you realize that there's just no way that
No.
you have a completely panoptic view of all the issues.
No, and even so, let's say you were, like, following David Chalmers and saying, like, "Oh, I'm gonna be a techno philosopher," and I say that 'cause I kinda wanna follow in that lead. That doesn't mean that you would know the ins and outs of the, fine details of current work on artificial general intelligence, because maybe you're thinking about simulation hypothesis, and you
Yeah.
spent, 5 years writing a dissertation on that. So
Mm.
just because you're even in this field doesn't mean that you understand what's going on here, let alone, like, the robot ethics or, like, the ethics of self-driving cars. So it's just there's so much, and I really love it, so I wanna bring it all on, but, it's hard to be a generalist today.
Oh, almost impossible.
Yeah.
Why is it people say that? What's that phrase? That Samuel Taylor Coleridge was the last person ever to read everything.
Yeah,
You know,
something like that.
that was the last. Is that the phrase? He that was the last time you could actually be a real, true generalist.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, I find camera robots fascinating as well as self-driving cars.
yeah,
Like, there's fascinating issues around using robots to care for vulnerable people, and there's also
oh, yeah,
fascinating philosophical issues around how the society views what is and is not an appropriate job for robots. And
right, right.
I think that
Yeah,
would carry it too far afield.
that's right. Well, you're gonna definitely have to come back on to talk more about this. I think we should probably define natural kind for some folks
Mm.
who aren't familiar with that language. Can you help us? What's a natural kind, and what is that distinguished against, I guess?
Yeah. So I like to use a medical analogy. So the difference between cholera and colic.
Hmm,
So cholera is a medical condition which is yeah, associated with lots of different kinds of symptoms.
hmm,
But what makes them all cholera is that there's a cluster of symptoms which are similar to a cluster of symptoms, but they are all caused by the same underlying mechanism.
okay,
It's either a bacterium or a virus. I honestly can't remember which it is. I think it's bacterial, but I might be
okay,
wrong. So there you've got an underlying unity, a thing that's underlying all the things. So even though cholera might present differently in different subjects, it's underlined by this underlying common mechanism.
mhm,
The contrast classes with colic. So colic, taken in its broadest possible meaning, actually refers to loads of different kinds of things. So there's baby colic, which is excessive crying in newborn babies. Horse colic, which is a condition of their intestines.
hmm,
Devon colic, which is a very old-fashioned word for, I think it was caused by lead poisoning.
huh,
So the word colic, I don't know if it's really used that way anymore, but the word colic certainly used to be used to cover all these different medical conditions. And they are when you compare cholera and colic, you just feel that they're different things. Like colic is just a word for tons of different stuff. And the reason we have one term for all of them is just kind of historical accident.
Right.
You know, a doctor should not treat baby colic in the same way that a vet would treat horse colic. It's just not appropriate. They're just not the same thing.
Right.
Whereas cholera, even though it might manifest in different symptoms, is importantly unified because of this underlying similarity. And that's the idea, which is that sometimes there are certain ways of there are all sorts of properties out there in the world, but some of them are caused by an underlying unity. There's something really important about certain groups of things, which means that they should be grouped together.
Yeah.
And that all the instances of cholera are like that, whereas all the instances of colic aren't.
Okay.
So a classic example in philosophy is the periodic table of the elements.
Yeah.
Um, you know, a gold is the classic example. There are all sorts of different instances of gold. In theory, it can be a gas, it can be a solid, it can be a liquid, it can have molten gold. But all those things, they all have really different superficial properties. Like the property of gold as a gas, as opposed to property of gold as a solid, they're totally different, really.
Mm.
They behave totally differently. But underlying them, there's this important unity, which is that they all have the same atomic number. And that's why we should group them together. And that's what a natural kind is. They're groups of things which they they don't just have superficial similarity, they have a deep similarity because in some important sense, they stem from the same origin. Like all instances of gold, they all have the same atomic number. All instances of cholera, they have the same underlying cause. And that's the idea of a natural kind, is that certain kinds of similarity in nature are for good, proper underlying causal reasons.
Right.
Others like colic, they're not even that similar. But
Mm.
even if different instances of colic were, they're not the same thing because they're totally different mechanisms cause them.
Yeah.
That's roughly the idea.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I think since we were talking about machine functionalism a little bit already, I wonder about the distinction between like a natural kind and a functional concept. Like,
Mm,
you look at a bunch of different mouse traps, and one, I don't want to get too mean to mice, but one like pulls a trigger on a gun, one is poison, one's a little miniature guillotine. Like they're all mouse traps, and it looks like there's a unifying functional concept, which is like kill mice.
mm,
But it doesn't look like that's a natural kind because mouse traps are uh, artifacts,
mhm.
that like humans make. So I wonder about that. Like, what do you, how do you, how can we relate functional concepts to natural kinds? Like, what's the difference?
Well, I mean, I have to ask what kind of mousetraps you have if one of them pulls a trigger on a gun.
Yeah,
Uh,
I'm an American, man. We that's our thing. Yeah, just
I
kidding.
we get it. Um, yeah, I just think what you said is absolutely right. Like, lots of functional kinds just aren't natural kinds.
Yeah,
One of the classic old-fashioned examples is a corkscrew. So you have the waiter's corkscrew, which you just put in and pull out. You have the weird one with the arms that come up that you twist down.
yeah.
You have that really fancy one where you put it in, flip the metal thing over the top, and then
Oh
squeeze
yeah.
it. Do you know those ones?
Yep, yep.
Um, yeah, the idea there is that it's a functional kind because they are defined by their function. They take
Right.
cork out of wine bottles, but it's not a natural kind because they have a superficial functional similarity,
Yeah,
but that is all they have. They do the same thing, but that is all there is to their similarity.
yeah,
They're not the same thing because they actually emerged in nature together or something, obviously.
yeah, yeah.
They so I it's not that no functional kinds are natural kinds,
Right.
but there are loads of functional kinds which aren't natural kinds, like
Yeah.
corkscrews, mouse traps, things like that. Yeah.
So when I don't want to make the rest of this about natural kinds, but I'm wondering about I already mentioned it, but if I 3D print a tiger
Mm,
from no genes, no atoms, well, it's hard to distinguish if any of these atoms were ever part of a tiger. But let's just say there's I got a whole bunch of atoms over here. They're or fundamental particles. However deep we're 3D printing. But I 3D print a tiger. It looks like it doesn't have
Mm,
the same causal history as the tiger
yeah.
that was born naturally. Does that still count? Is it still a tiger, or do we have to say like it's tiger star?
Yes, excellent question. Mm, I mean, you're basically picking up on um, questions of whether biological kinds are historically
Yeah, right.
individuated.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the question that's strongly associated with figures like Ruth Millikan.
Hmm.
Um, there's two. I'm just going to dodge that question, but I
Okay.
will. I will
All right. That's fine.
because genuinely, I don't know. There's a bunch of different issues there. One
Yeah.
of them is like, is it strictly speaking a tiger? Because that tiger is arguably it's a species categorization, but that's different from a functional categorization. So,
Mhm.
like this is more sort of philosophy of biology, but one question is: are species historically individuated? Um, like, is it essential to a particular species that it has a certain history?
Yeah.
If the answer is yes, then it's not a tiger. But it's completely different question to say, well, what about its organs, like its liver and its heart and its pores and stuff?
Mhm.
Are they historically individuated? And that's where you find, I think, much more of a split,
Okay.
where the ahistorical theorists might say, yeah, it's got all it's got functional, so it has all the same functions, whereas the historical theorists would say, no, if those organs don't have the right evolutionary history or the right history of any kind, then they don't even count as organs, much less
Yeah.
as being like a tiger.
Yeah.
The only other thing I'll say is it's a slightly complicated case because, of course, in a way, the tiger you're creating is historically linked to real tigers because you based it on a on a tiger. Do you see what I
Right.
mean?
Right. So that's the concept in my brain or my head or my mind, whatever. That's
Mm,
the link between historical tigers and this 3D printed one. So there is still a
yeah,
link, but it's through a mind. And then we enter into some
yeah.
mind stuff, and I like that. That's really cool.
I'd be inclined. I don't have really fully worked out views in the philosophy of biology, but my immediate thought would be the concepts we use to do things like individuate species in biology are
Mm.
shaped by what biologists need to do.
Yeah.
And therefore that they break down with really exotic science fiction cases here.
Okay. That's
That's my gut instinct, but I don't have kind of like an argument.
that's good. I tried to give one that wasn't too science fictiony because of 3D printing. I could have gone with like a Davidsonian lightning
Swamp,
strikes a yeah, swamp tiger, right? And like
swamp tiger.
yeah,
Yeah.
it strikes the thing, and then there's no, blueprint in my brain, but, or in my head, in my mind. But anyways, we went far afield again. Uh, tightening it all back up, so we have natural kinds. Folks, if you wanna talk more about natural kinds, I'll have to get philosopher of biology on, and we'll talk about that stuff too, but,
Oh yeah.
considering consciousness as a natural kind, I don't know if it's worth bringing up the natural kinds framework, the 4 steps. Do you think
Well,
we should or
I think we can do it in a simpler way.
okay.
So very roughly, here's the idea. So
Yeah,
imagine gold is a natural kind, which most people would say it is. I mean, there are people who don't believe in natural kinds. We can't engage with them here.
sure. Yeah.
We just haven't got space. Um, so imagine you do believe in natural kinds, and most people would say that gold is a natural kind.
Mhm.
And all the instances of gold are unified by their common atomic structure. They all have atomic number 79. Now, what you've got there is a group of properties, which are kind of superficial properties of gold,
Mhm.
like being yellowy, being malleable,
Mhm.
I suppose being found in the seams of rocks.
Good
Um,
conductors.
Sorry?
Being good conductors or whatever,
Yeah,
conducting
good
a
conductors. Yeah, yeah. Um, Now, those properties are superficial properties of gold,
mhm.
and they are all underpinned by this common thing, which is all having atomic number 79.
Mhm.
Now, what's interesting about that is that gives you a really good test for what gold is. So if you have a sample of some substance and you say, well, is it gold or not? Well, there's all sorts of things you could do to test that. You could test its conductivity. You could you could test how malleable it is and so on.
Yep.
But the best test is to work out whether it has atomic number 79,
Mm.
because that's the kind of underlying nature to gold.
Yeah.
Now, with consciousness, the idea is meant to be something like this. Consciousness is meant to be like a property of the brain or the mind or the soul or whatever. That those debates don't matter for the natural kinds approach, as far as I can
Right.
tell. But so let's just say brain, but it's consistent with dualism. You can just, it doesn't matter. That debate doesn't matter here. So consciousness is a feature of the brain, let's say, and that feature, that property, the property of being conscious, is associated with lots of other features in the
Mhm.
brain as well. So in the same way that all these little properties, like being yellowy, being malleable, they all cluster around atomic number 79,
Mhm.
because having atomic number 79 explains why instances of gold have those properties.
Yeah.
The idea is you say the same. You look for stuff in the brain, superficial properties which cluster around consciousness. So you might say, well, consciousness is commonly associated with this particular kind of behavior or this particular brain signature, or, and then you do sort of normal tests, just using normal psychological experiments, in order to identify what the underlying property of consciousness is.
Yeah.
And then whatever that is, you look for the signatures of it and you can track that in different, scenarios.
Right.
But here's another way of putting it. When it comes to gold, your best marker of whether something's gold or not is having atomic number 79.
Mhm.
So you start with superficial properties like being yellow and being malleable. You discover the underlying property. Then you identify that in a range of scenarios that helps you track where gold is. With consciousness, you look at all the superficial properties that are associated with it. You try and find out what brain thingy is underlying them,
Yeah.
or mind thingy or soul thingy. Whatever it is that's underlying that cluster of properties, you identify that and you try and track that in different scenarios.
Mhm.
What's especially exciting about this, or meant to be exciting about it, is that you don't necessarily have to track that property in the way that psychology has traditionally tracked consciousness. Whatever that property is, as long as you can identify it through whatever means you like,
Yeah.
you can identify consciousness.
Yeah.
How was that? Was that
No,
okay?
that's very good. That's very good. I'm wondering, maybe it's anticipating where we're going, but I wonder how you would do that, 'cause the traditional method in psychology, it's verbal report, right?
Yeah.
And
Well,
so
it's
this
verbal
is saying
report and various other behavioral cues, like you might get a subject to press a button or something.
right, right. But so this one is saying, no, it's is it looking more like neurochemistry and brain mapping and stuff?
Typically, yeah, that's the
Yeah,
kind of thing.
yeah,
So a much cruder way of putting it, which misses out on some of the subtleties, is you don't use verbal reports. You look at the brain stuff that's underlying verbal report and then track that
yeah,
directly.
yeah,
That's the idea.
yeah.
It's a slightly cruder way of putting it, but the picture's the same, which is you don't use verbal rapport
Mhm.
or even things like cognitive access. You try and identify what's underpinning all that stuff,
Yeah,
and track that. That's the
yeah.
idea.
And then so you toss in some false negatives and say this is
Yes.
a problem for the view. Can you help us with that?
So when you're looking at consciousness as a natural kind, what you want is a cluster of properties which tend to indicate, um, the presence of consciousness in a
Yeah,
subject. They're what I'd call its markers. There are various different markers you could use. One of them is what's called trace conditioning versus delay conditioning. So basically, the experiment is something like this: you you have um, you have a particular noise, a tone, and then in certain circumstances, you fire a puff of air onto the subject's eye. Now, one of the strange things, and then after you do that, you get the subject to assess whether they could tell that the puff was going to follow the tone or not.
Right.
One of the strange things about it is that subjects seem to make this prediction unconsciously if there isn't a gap between the tone and the puff. Whereas if there is a gap, there seems to be a need for conscious awareness before they can make the prediction.
Okay.
Very roughly, that's the idea. So the idea is one kind of conditioning requires consciousness, the other just doesn't. One of them's totally unconscious, the other requires consciousness.
Yeah.
So you say, okay, good. Well, the kind of conditioning that requires consciousness, that's a marker of consciousness. When you have that, you must have consciousness.
Right.
If the subject needs to be conscious of the tone and the puff, if they need to be conscious of that in order to make that prediction, then that's a marker. You can use that as a sign of consciousness. So the problem basically is the natural kinds approach requires all these markers of consciousness, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because what you do is you look at the markers of consciousness, then try and identify the property that underpins them in the same way that you start with all these properties of gold and try and identify its atomic number. The problem is if our picture of what those markers are radically false or misleading, then the whole thing is slowly going to fall apart.
Right.
Because you're going to start off with the wrong set. It relies on you having sets of markers which reliably indicate the presence or absence of consciousness.
And that's the step one in the framework we didn't cover, but marker assembly. And so if you're, I think there is kind of a recurrent, to use that word again, step in the natural kind framework where they go back and they can like exclude. But in order to get the whole ball rolling, it's like a bootstrapping problem of like we have to get the right markers initially and assemble them.
Exactly. That's a bootstrapping problem is exactly the right word.
Okay.
So very roughly, if you had to summarize the problem, you would say something like this. And what I'm about to say is actually not fair to the natural kinds frameworks. It is more sophisticated than this. But here's a kind of vague gloss on what the problem is. In order for the natural kinds framework to help you measure consciousness, you need a set of markers of consciousness which you can rely on. You need things which reliably indicate the presence and absence of conscious experience. But that's the whole problem you're trying to solve.
Right.
You're trying to come up with something that measures consciousness.
Yeah.
So if we had a set of markers of consciousness where we were like, yeah, that's great. We would, you don't need natural kinds. You'd go home.
Right.
The
consciousness meter.
Very roughly, that's the problem.
Yeah. If you had the consciousness meter, you don't need this theory. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Any view which requires you to have a good set of markers of consciousness from the word go cannot help you measure consciousness, because that's what the whole problem is, basically.
Yeah.
That's the idea.
That's really good. Well, okay, so I want to bring up one last thing here and then just a couple random ones. Then you got to get to class. And I have a puppy who's probably driving my wife nuts right now.
I need to teach terminology.
That's right. Okay, so just real quickly, multiple kinds view of consciousness. Consciousness may be associated with more than one natural kind. How is this a problem? Yeah, why I think that this is a problem, and what are we even talking about here?
I love this view. I think it's. I love this view in the sense, I don't know whether it's true or not, but I think it's really interesting philosophically. The main proponent of this view, although I don't know if she still holds it, is Elizabeth Irvine, who wrote a really, really good book called Consciousness as a Scientific Concept. Basically, the idea is, certain things are natural kinds and other things actually just refer to loads of different natural kinds. So, colic is an example of something that refers to many different natural kinds. Really, horse colic, Devon colic, baby colic, they're different things.
Yeah.
So that's a possible feature of consciousness. It might be, for example, that visual consciousness and auditory consciousness are just different natural kinds. That's possible.
Yeah.
It might be that the consciousness associated with thought is a different natural kind from the consciousness associated with vision, maybe.
Yeah.
Um, in which case, the sort of basic way of putting the problem is you've almost made a mistake by trying to come up with a unified scientific study of it in the first place.
Yeah.
That would be like trying to come up with one theory that covers all different kinds of colic. It just wouldn't work
Right.
because they shouldn't be grouped together for the purposes of science.
Yeah.
Right. That's not that wouldn't mean that science can't study consciousness. It would just mean that trying to have a methodology, one methodology
Yeah.
to study consciousness, which is kind of what the natural kinds approach is, that would be as misguided as trying to study all the different kinds of colic under one banner if you were a doctor. It just wouldn't be a good idea.
Right. No, this is so good. So I wonder earlier, you just mentioned that that you're at least I believe you said you're like sympathetic at least to this view that like conscious states go with a subject. Is that a
Oh yeah,
good represent?
yeah, very much
So
so. Yeah, yeah.
so if there's multiple kinds of consciousness, if perception is different than abstract uh, thought, and those are all happening in one, does that mean that there's like is that still consistent with the view that there's a singular unified phenomenal conscious subject?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So the idea very roughly would just be like the different kinds of consciousness present in different conscious experiences would just be different properties of the same subject.
Cool.
So
Okay.
like a leg is a very different thing from a head,
Yeah.
but I have both.
Yeah.
They're different natural kinds, but I have both.
Okay.
They're both. I mean, they're not strictly speaking properties, but you can loosely say they're both properties of me.
Yeah.
My mass and my height are different, but they're both of me.
Yeah.
So if consciousness was associated with different kinds, the view would get slightly more complex, but not. It wouldn't be a problem for the view that there's one subject
Well,
associated with conscious experience.
so okay, so putting on my phenomenologist hat and saying like there's a unified field that I have of consciousness right now, and I'm hearing and I'm kind of tasting the coffee that's still in my mouth and all this you can abstract them out and represent them as different qualia, but or yeah, you can take the each individual quale, but actually there's this unified experience that I'm having. Is the But if there's multiple kinds of consciousness, it seems like really it's like auditory qualia and visual qualia and abstract
Mm.
thought qualia, and they're like a bundle theory, and I'm putting them all together, and it's not really a unified experience. What do you make of that?
Yeah. Well, two things. First thing is I don't really know what the unity of consciousness is meant to be.
Okay.
I don't. Um, maybe I just don't have it, but like, I, I was never quite sure what people were really getting at. Like, I have conscious experiences, and some of them feel like I can get the sense in which my experience of this is like spatially related to my experience of that. But the people who talk a lot about unity seem to be talking about something a bit stronger. I was never quite sure what that was.
Yeah.
So my answer might just be really unsatisfactory because it's not that I don't think there is such a thing as unity of consciousness. I'm just not quite sure exactly which feature they're sort of trying to pinpoint.
Okay.
Um, that's more. I'm not a skeptic. I'm just.
Sure.
Uh, I would need way more information before I was really sure exactly what the unity of consciousness amounted to.
Yeah.
But having said that, I think I'd be inclined to say that this stuff about whether consciousness is a natural kind, it's all meant to be pitched at quite a sort of deep, sort of scientific level.
Yeah.
We're very much looking for underlying properties, brain properties, or more metaphysical mind, soul, whatever. That's
Yeah.
that's the level at which we're aiming.
Yeah.
Um, when we ask whether it's a natural kind or not. So it's totally consistent with that they might be different natural kinds at a scientific level, but unified at the level of phenomenology. They might share similarities at the phenomenological level whilst being disunified at scientific level.
Okay.
Uh,
Yeah,
but
yeah, so
consistent.
that's so good because there's the binding problem in neuroscience, and then there's the phenomenal unity of consciousness at the philosophy of mind level, and so
Mm.
yeah, they're related, but they're 2 different problems depending on, like, if you're looking at the manifest image or the scientific image, I guess. Um,
Yeah, it's a manifest scientific image thing. Yeah,
yeah,
it's
that's cool.
consciousness is unified in relation to the manifest image. Uh, if a multiple kinds view is correct, which I don't know if it is,
Yeah,
then they would be disunified at a scientific level.
nice.
That's a lovely way of putting it. Yeah.
Okay, okay. Um, alright, so last one here for you. So we got this problem. It looks like maybe like an undercutting defeater for the natural kinds view because they said we can do this work, and you're saying no, you can't because you got false negatives and we got potentially multiple kinds and stuff. So wrapping all that up, I wonder, just totally speculative, but it has to do with natural kind stuff. If we made synthetic consciousness, um, because I don't know how else to talk about this anymore. Because people say artificial general intelligence doesn't necessitate consciousness because intelligence and
Right.
consciousness come apart. So I'm calling it synthetic consciousness, lab made consciousness.
Yeah.
If natural kinds view is true and consciousness is a natural kind, does that mean that you can't really make synthetic consciousness? I guess it would depend on what you mean by synthetic, but you just kind of tapped into like these maybe like psychophysical
Mm.
laws that are already there, but you just tapped into it in a new way other than the biological way of creating an infant in natural ways. You get
Yeah.
yeah, would that follow, or what do you think?
I think no, I don't think it would follow, but I think what would actually end up happening, um, I think we might reach a point where the natural kinds. So let's assume consciousness is a natural kind.
Yeah.
We might have reached the point where it starts the questions like what you just asked start to turn on old issues like to do with functionalism and things.
Yeah.
And it might be my hunch. I might be wrong about this. But my hunch is the natural kinds approach doesn't have much to offer there.
Okay, great.
So the natural kinds approach says what you should do is you should look for an underlying property, which is the property of consciousness, and that's the natural kind property of consciousness. But one way it could go is you find that it's a brain property that synthetic organisms, synthetic beings can't have.
Mhm.
Another view, if dualism is correct, maybe it's a soul property that, again, maybe synthetic machines can't have.
Yeah.
In which case, the answer is no, it wouldn't be conscious. But it might just be a functional property, which maybe synthetic machines can have, in which
Yeah.
case, yeah, they can have consciousness. So it's not that the natural kind approach is irrelevant to that question,
Yeah.
but I very much think it comes down to, well, is consciousness underpinned by a functional property or by a biological one or
Yeah.
by something else? And those
Yeah.
are, as you know, those are all questions from the 60s and 70s and 80s.
Right.
And I'm not entirely convinced the natural kinds approach has much to add.
Okay, that's so I'm thinking in my mind, I was thinking the upshot of the multiple kinds versus natural kinds debate would be it would have some practical implications for robot
Mm.
ethics because if in my mind, if it's a natural kind, then you reach this level. So if you have I guess this would be functionalism maybe, but if you have like an analog, it doesn't have to be like an isomorph of us, but something that has consciousness that is analogous to ours that was made in a lab, then it
Mm.
looks like it should probably have the same rights that come with ours. But if you go in for like a multiple kinds view, then maybe it shouldn't because it's been programmed or it's been created with different goals. And so maybe it
Oh,
really
I
likes do
see.
you see what I'm saying? So it
Yeah,
wouldn't have the
yeah.
same rights as us because it's just a different type of thing. Although it's conscious,
I see.
it's not
Yeah.
analogous. It's a whole different new thing. It didn't reach our level. It's a different whole thing. That's the tiger analogy, going back to that too. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me really strongly of, do you know the pig that wants to be? Do you know
I don't
this?
think so. I don't think so.
It's a joke in a joke in one of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy books.
Oh, okay, I've only read the first one.
Oh, okay. I think it's in the second, but
Okay.
my my colleagues who are, if anything, even nerdier than me would absolutely hate me for not being able to remember which one it is. But I think it's in that. And
Okay.
the idea is some chef uh, uses science to breed a pig who that desperately wishes to be eaten.
Yeah, it sounds exactly right. Yeah, this
Yeah.
is what yeah.
And then the question is it right to eat them? Um, so if the organism or the synthetic machine had a kind of consciousness such that its desires were completely and utterly diverging from ours, would it be would it have the same moral rights or would it have very different ones?
Yes. Yeah.
Don't know.
Oh, it's
I
so
don't
good. I mean,
know. I do wonder sometimes whether, you know, I mean, maybe you've thought more about this than me because I'm really not an ethicist, but is it the case that we think that consciousness matters for ethics because that's what that's where you manifest your desires? And like your desires are what matter ethically? Or is it more that if something's conscious, it has certain rights, no matter what its view on those desires are? Do you see
I
what I'm
I think
saying?
that's yeah, I think that's a kind of a live debate. And so I am a Christian, and I'm in more Christian philosopher circles, and I think the second one is the way that a lot of Christians go, but they also will many of them will limit it to the imago Dei, the image of God, to human beings, whereas my secular friends, who have a lot of them as well, they wanna ground ethics in consciousness because of pain, and
Oh, yes, of course. I
right?
see.
And so, that would be weird because what would be painful for me would be if you made me write a bunch of, cover letters for academics and stuff looking for jobs. I would hate that. But if you made a large language model or some other, whatever, maybe Ben Goertzel has the right way of making AI that way, but all the goals and sub goals are like, I want to make cover letters, then it wouldn't be painful and it wouldn't be wrong to like force, right? But make a this
Yeah.
synthetic conscious being write cover letters.
So you want to build a machine that desperately wants to write
I
your
don't want to. If
body.
someone does, if so, I don't have to write that many cover letters. That's why I'm doing the podcast, so I'll never have to do that again. But if someone did,
Right.
you know,
Imagine the machine that didn't just write you cover letters, but it desperately wanted to and really enjoyed it.
yeah, yeah,
What
you'd
what
have to be careful.
fascinating modern age we live in.
Yeah, right. I know, man. But it seems like maybe ethically you should probably aim for that because you should probably not make a conscious being like us and then force it to do menial tasks that we hate doing because that just sounds like slavery.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I would have thought that. I don't know. I'm really outside my field right now.
No, this is
But
great.
the AI ethicists that have talked about desire satisfaction in AI is that there must be people who thought about the
So
desires of robots.
I'm not
I
sure.
mean,
This is
desire satisfaction is a huge field in ethics, isn't it? So there must
yeah,
be some relevance to AI.
I'm sure, but that's why I think like the natural kind stuff. I understand that it's like no, we're looking at the biological markers and stuff, but that's why I think this question's so interesting because I want to know if we're making a synthetic conscious being, will it? It's the question of Ultron versus Mr. Meeseeks. Mr. Meeseeks is from Rick and Morty, and you push a button and he pops into existence and he wants to do a task for you, and then he pops out when he's done. But
Right.
Ultron was kind of like a really smart Tony Stark and was like, look, well, it depends on how you interpret Ultron in the movie. Uh, but
What film is this?
Ultron is from the Avengers. He's a AI that runs amok right away and tries to blow up the world because he's trying to have peace. And so it's a whole thing. But it's like if you created a synthetic me, I would not want to do your cover letters. But if you created a synthetic uh, cover letter writer, then he would be like, yes, I would love to do that for you. Like genuinely, I'm not lying. I would love to do that. So I think that that's an important thing to think about. Well, like why make a conscious being before you solve that?
It is interesting. Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. I've met people who love doing things that I would absolutely hate. And I used to play a lot of chess, and I know loads of people absolutely can't stand that.
Sure.
When you meet a human, it seems somehow really patronizing to tell them what they should and shouldn't like. Uh, so
Yeah.
why think why shouldn't we satisfy a artificial being's desires?
Yeah.
If they like writing cover letters, would it not be patronizing of us to say that that was somehow an inferior? I don't know.
Yeah, right. Or if you had the choice between making one that doesn't, so they both have the same job, they're gonna write cover letters. But if you had the choice between making one that really enjoyed it or one that felt the way you do, where you don't like it doing it, then you should definitely make the one that likes doing it.
I don't know. I
This
don't
is good.
know.
This is so
No, I
good.
mean, no, I'm really interested in AI ethics, but
Yeah.
I find my ethical intuitions break down around this area.
Sure. Sure.
And I would really like to make judgments based just on intuition anyway, if you know
Yeah,
what
yeah, yeah. Yeah.
I mean. I don't know is the short answer, but
Yeah.
I do. I certainly think it's a good question. I hope there are people who are paid to think about it.
It's
Of course
awesome.
not, in fact.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Henry, this has been so much fun, man. We covered some really deep stuff, and we didn't cover some deep stuff because there's so much to the paper.
Thank
So
you.
I wanna commend everyone. Go check it out. It's called Consciousness as a Natural Kind and the Methodological Puzzle of Consciousness. I can't remember if it's out yet or what journal it's in.
It's in Mind and Language.
Okay, awesome.
And
And
it's out.
it's already out. Cool. Well, fantastic. If somebody wanted to read some more of your stuff, where might they find you?
Or you can just Google my name, Henry
Awesome.
Taylor Philosophy, and you find my website, and there's all sorts of bits and bobs there.
Awesome.
Uh, it's, yeah,
Very cool. Well,
popular, the public engagement stuff I've done as well, if they're
oh,
interested in it.
awesome. Awesome. This has been so much fun. Like this has got to be one of my favorites in recent times because you're so fun to talk with and thanks for letting me go down all these rabbit trails and crazy questions. Like this is what I really enjoy. So this was a real treat for me.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it as well. I just think there might have been a generational difference with like Hitchhiker's Guide versus Voltron. Ultron.
Ultron. Yeah, yeah.
I'll give that a Google
It's
and
so good.
get back to you.
Definitely. Awesome. Awesome. Well, you'll have to come back on and talk more consciousness with us in the future. Folks, for now, that's going to have to do it. This has been Parker's Pensées. And as always, all glory to God.